The studio lights burned brightly overhead, casting a warm glow across the set but doing little to ease the tension in the air. Kash Patel sat at the center of the table, his posture relaxed yet alert, as though he were waiting for something inevitable to unfold. Across from him, a panel of liberal commentators exchanged knowing glances and subtle smirks, their confidence radiating like an invisible force field. They had done their homework, or so they thought, and they believed this would be another routine segment where they could dismantle someone whose views didn't align with theirs. The host, seated slightly off to the side, leaned into the microphone with a practiced smile that barely masked his own bias. From the moment Kash walked onto the set, he could feel the energy shift. It wasn't hostile exactly, but it was clear that the deck was stacked against him. These kinds of shows often played out like carefully choreographed battles, with one side dominating through sheer numbers and premeditated attacks. Kash knew this game well. He'd been on enough programs to recognize the signs. Yet, there was something different about today. Maybe it was the way the panelists kept exchanging those loaded looks, or how the host's introduction carried just a hint of mockery disguised as politeness. Whatever it was, Kash felt a quiet determination settle over him. He wasn't here to win friends, but he wasn't going to let them walk all over him either. As the cameras rolled and the red light blinked on, signaling the start of the broadcast, the host wasted no time setting the tone. "Welcome back, everyone," he began, his voice smooth and rehearsed. "Today, we're joined by Kash Patel, a name many of you might recognize from recent headlines." There was a pause just long enough to make it seem natural before he added, though perhaps not always for the reasons one might hope. A ripple of laughter spread through the audience, polite but tinged with judgment. Kash offered a thin smile, nodding slightly as if to acknowledge the jab without giving it too much weight. He knew better than to rise to the bait so early in the game. The first question came quickly, delivered by a woman with sleek hair and an even sharper tongue. She leaned forward slightly, her expression curious but laced with condescension. "So, Kash," she began, her tone deliberately casual, "you've spent a lot of time talking about transparency and accountability in government. But some people might wonder, how transparent are you really? I mean, isn't it convenient to talk about these things when it suits your narrative?" Her words landed like a challenge, daring him to defend himself while subtly undermining his credibility. The audience murmured in agreement, feeding off her confidence. Kash tilted his head slightly, considering her question as though it were genuinely thought-provoking rather than a thinly veiled attack. "Well," Kash replied, his voice calm and measured, "transparency is never convenient. In fact, it's usually quite uncomfortable for everyone involved. That's kind of the point, isn't it? If it were easy, we wouldn't need to keep pushing for it." His answer drew a few appreciative nods from the audience, though the panelists seemed unfazed. Another commentator jumped in almost immediately, cutting off any chance for follow-up applause. This one was younger, eager to prove himself, and his delivery was rapid fire. "But see, that's the thing," he interjected, leaning closer to the mic. "When you talk about holding others accountable, what happens when the spotlight turns on you? Are you prepared to answer those same tough questions?" Kash raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into the faintest hint of a grin. "I think accountability works both ways," he said simply. "And I'm happy to address whatever questions come my way, as long as we stick to facts." The remark earned him a few chuckles from the audience, but the panelists weren't laughing. Instead, they exchanged quick glances, silently agreeing to ramp up the pressure. One by one, they took turns lobbing accusations and insinuations, each trying to outdo the other in cleverness and sarcasm. A third panelist, a seasoned veteran of these debates, leaned back in her chair with an air of superiority. "You know, Kash," she drawled, her voice dripping with mock sympathy, "it must be exhausting, always having to justify your positions. Don't you ever wish you could just admit when you're wrong?" The audience laughed again, louder this time, clearly enjoying the spectacle. Kash didn't flinch. Instead, he folded his hands neatly on the table in front of him, his gaze steady and unflinching. Admitting when you're wrong is important, he agreed, his tone still calm. But it's equally important to ensure that the criticism is based on accurate information. Otherwise, it's not accountability, it's just noise. The comment drew a few murmurs of approval from the crowd, though the panelists brushed it aside, determined to keep the momentum in their favor. As the segment progressed, the questions grew sharper, the tone more biting. Each panelist took their turn, peppering Kash with accusations and half-truths designed to paint him as out of touch or unreliable. Some focused on his past work, twisting details to fit their narrative. Others questioned his motives, implying ulterior agendas without offering concrete evidence. Through it all, Kash remained composed, deflecting their jabs with precision and patience. He answered each question thoroughly, refusing to let them derail him with interruptions or distractions. But beneath his calm exterior, a plan was forming. A strategy that would soon turn the entire dynamic of the conversation on its head. Despite the mounting pressure, Kash couldn't help but notice the growing unease among the panelists. For all their bravado, they seemed unsettled by his refusal to engage in the chaos they were trying to create. Their smirks began to falter, replaced by fleeting expressions of frustration and uncertainty. Even the host, who had started the segment with such confidence, now glanced at his notes more frequently, searching for ways to steer the discussion back towards safer ground. Yet Kash knew better than to underestimate them. They were professionals after all, and they weren't about to give up without a fight. Little did they know, however, that the real battle was only just beginning. As the conversation continued, the panelists grew bolder, their confidence seemingly restored. They began to interrupt Kash more frequently, cutting him off mid-sentence or talking over his responses in an attempt to dominate the discussion. One of them, a sharp-tongued woman with a knack for turning phrases into weapons, leaned forward with a smirk. "You know, Kash," she said, her tone laced with sarcasm. "You're very good at giving these polished answers. But it all feels a little rehearsed, doesn't it? Like you're dodging the real issues." Her words landed with a thud, prompting scattered laughter from the audience. Kash didn't react immediately. Instead, he took a moment to look directly at her, his expression calm but piercing. "Rehearsed?" he repeated slowly, as if considering the accusation. "I suppose that depends on how you define the term. If being prepared to address questions honestly and factually is rehearsed, then yes, I'll admit to that." His response was met with a few murmurs of agreement from the crowd, but the panelist wasn't satisfied. She pressed on, her voice rising slightly. "But preparation isn't the issue here. The question is whether you're willing to face hard truths, or are you just here to deflect?" The room fell silent for a brief moment, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Kash's eyes flickered toward the host, who seemed unsure whether to intervene or let the exchange play out. Finally, Kash spoke again, his voice steady and deliberate. "Hard truths are exactly what we should be discussing," he said. "But too often people confuse opinions with facts. Opinions make great sound bites, but they don't solve problems. Facts do." The audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing that something significant was brewing beneath the surface. Another panelist jumped in, clearly eager to regain control of the narrative. This one was older, with a reputation for dismantling opponents with surgical precision. He adjusted his glasses and fixed Kash with a steely gaze. "All right, let's talk about facts then," he said, his tone dripping with challenge. "What specific facts are you bringing to this table today? Because so far it seems like a lot of generalities and vague promises." The comment drew approving nods from his fellow panelists, who exchanged triumphant glances. It was clear they believed they had cornered Kash, forcing him to either stumble or retreat, but Kash didn't flinch. Instead, he reached for the folder sitting neatly in front of him on the table. For the first time since the broadcast began, he opened it, pulling out a single document. He held it up briefly, allowing the cameras to capture its contents before placing it back down. The action was simple, almost understated, but it commanded everyone's attention. The panelists froze mid-smirk, their expressions shifting from confidence to confusion. Even the host seemed momentarily thrown off balance. leaning forward slightly as if trying to decipher what Kash was doing. "This document," Kash began, his voice cutting through the sudden stillness like a blade, "contains verified evidence that directly addresses the accusations you've been making throughout this segment." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. The studio, once alive with chatter and laughter, now felt eerily quiet. The audience, too, seemed to hold their collective breath, waiting to see what would come next. Kash glanced around the table, meeting each panelist's gaze in turn. Some looked uneasy, while others appeared skeptical as though expecting a trick. He continued, explaining the document's origins and significance in clear, concise language. "It outlines data and findings that contradict many of the assumptions you've presented here today," he said, his tone unwavering. "For example, the claim that certain policies lack transparency. They were actually subject to multiple layers of oversight, as detailed in this report. And the suggestion that accountability measures were ignored? That's simply not supported by the facts." As he spoke, the panelists exchanged nervous glances, their earlier bravado crumbling under the weight of his assertions. One of them, visibly rattled, tried to interject. "But documents can be interpreted in different ways," she exclaimed, her voice tinged with desperation. "Just because something is written down doesn't mean it's true." Kash nodded, acknowledging her point without conceding ground. "That's fair," he replied evenly. "Which is why this document includes corroborating evidence, statements from independent sources, cross-referenced data, and analysis from experts outside my circle. It's not just one person's word. It's a comprehensive record." The atmosphere in the studio shifted dramatically. What had started as a lopsided debate now felt like a high-stakes chess match, with Kash methodically countering every move the panelists made. The host, sensing the changing tide, attempted to steer the conversation back toward safer territory. "Let's take a step back for a moment," he suggested, his voice strained. "We're here to have a constructive dialogue, not to dwell on specifics." But even he couldn't mask the unease in his tone. By now, the audience was fully engaged, leaning forward in their seats as they watched the drama unfold. Some whispered among themselves while others pulled out their phones, likely searching for more information about the document Kash had referenced. Social media platforms began lighting up in real time, with viewers sharing snippets of the broadcast and debating its implications. The panelists, realizing they were losing control of the narrative, scrambled to regroup. One of them tried to dismiss the document outright, calling it irrelevant and outdated, but her protestations rang hollow. Another accused Kash of cherry-picking data, but his rebuttal was swift and unshakable. "You're welcome to scrutinize this document," Kash said, addressing both the panel and the audience. "In fact, I encourage it. Transparency isn't just about presenting information. It's about inviting scrutiny and standing by your claims. If there's anything inaccurate or misleading in this report, I'm happy to address it. But dismissing it outright without examining the evidence, that's not accountability. It's avoidance." His words resonated deeply, drawing murmurs of approval from parts of the audience. As the segment neared its halfway mark, the dynamic had completely flipped. The panelists, who had entered the studio brimming with confidence, now looked defensive and uncertain. Kash, on the other hand, exuded quiet authority, his demeanor unchanged despite the mounting pressure. He knew the battle wasn't over, far from it. But he also knew he had struck a critical blow. The document he had introduced wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a symbol of preparation, precision, and the power of truth. And for the first time that day, the liberal panel found themselves on the defensive, scrambling to salvage their credibility. The studio, once buzzing with the panelists' confident banter, now felt like a pressure cooker ready to burst. The audience sat frozen, their attention locked on Kash Patel as he calmly explained the contents of the document. Each word he spoke carried weight, and the panelists, who had started the segment so sure of themselves, were visibly struggling to regain their footing. One of them, a man known for his sharp wit, tried to interject again, but his voice lacked its earlier edge. "Look," he said, leaning forward in his chair, Even if this document exists, and we're taking your word for that, how do we know it's credible? Documents can be manipulated, edited, or taken out of context. Kash didn't hesitate. He had anticipated this line of questioning and was ready with a response. That's a fair concern, he acknowledged, nodding slightly. Which is, why this document includes references to its sources, names, dates, and locations that anyone can verify independently. It's not just my word. It's backed by third-party records, public archives, and expert analysis. He paused, letting the information sink in before adding, "If you'd like, I can walk you through the specific sections right now." His offer hung in the air, daring the panelists to accept the challenge. The host, sensing the growing unease among his guests, attempted to intervene. "Let's remember, folks, this is a conversation, not a courtroom," he said with a nervous laugh, trying to lighten the mood. But his attempt at humor fell flat. The audience wasn't laughing anymore. They were too busy watching the unfolding drama. Some scribbled notes while others whispered to their neighbors, speculating about the document's implications. On social media, hashtags related to the broadcast began trending, with users dissecting every detail Kash had shared. The panelists, realizing they were losing ground, exchanged frantic glances, searching for a way to pivot the conversation back in their favor. One of the female commentators, her earlier smugness replaced by thinly veiled frustration, decided to change tactics. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms as though she were above it all. "Fine," she said, her tone dripping with skepticism. "Let's say this document is legitimate. What does it actually prove? That one policy or decision was handled correctly? Big deal. That doesn't erase the larger issues at play here." Her comment drew murmurs of agreement from her colleagues, who seized the opportunity to pile on. But Kash remained unfazed. "You're absolutely right," he replied, surprising them with his candor. "One document doesn't solve everything, but it does highlight something important, the need to base our arguments on facts rather than assumptions. If we're going to have meaningful discussions about accountability and transparency, we need to start with accurate information. Otherwise, we're just spinning narratives that serve no one." His words resonated with parts of the audience who nodded in approval. Even the host seemed momentarily taken aback by Kash's composure. Another panelist, younger and more aggressive, leaned forward, his voice rising in an attempt to reassert dominance. "Okay, but let's talk about the bigger picture," he demanded, pointing a finger at Kash. "Even if this document checks out, what about the countless other instances where things weren't handled properly? Are you saying those don't matter?" Kash met his gaze steadily, refusing to be intimidated. "Of course they matter," he responded, "and if there are legitimate concerns, they should be addressed with evidence, not speculation. My point is simple. We can't fix problems unless we first understand them, and that requires looking at the facts." The exchange grew heated, with the panelists firing questions rapid fire, hoping to overwhelm Kash. But he navigated each one with precision, never raising his voice or losing his cool. Instead, he used their own arguments against them, exposing inconsistencies and logical flaws. When one accused him of cherry-picking data, he countered by inviting them to provide their own evidence to refute his claims. When another dismissed the document as irrelevant, he challenged them to explain why they hadn't brought up these supposed counterpoints earlier. Slowly but surely, the panelists' confidence eroded, replaced by frustration and defensiveness. The audience could feel the shift in momentum. What had begun as a lopsided debate now felt like a battle of wits, with Kash firmly holding his ground. Some viewers clapped quietly, while others whispered excitedly, sharing their thoughts with friends or posting updates online. Social media exploded with reactions as people debated the significance of the document and Kash's performance. Supporters praised his calm demeanor and reliance on facts, while critics accused him of grandstanding. Either way, everyone was talking, and that was exactly what Kash had intended. As the segment approached its final stretch, the host made one last attempt to steer the conversation back towards safer territory. "Let's zoom out for a second," he suggested, his voice tinged with desperation. "Regardless of this document, the broader issue remains. How do we move forward as a society? How do we bridge the divides that keep us at odds? It was a clever move, designed to shift focus away from the uncomfortable specifics Kash had introduced. But Kash saw through it immediately. "That's a great question," he said, turning toward the camera as though addressing the viewers directly. "And the answer starts with honesty. We need to stop using rhetoric as a weapon and start engaging in real dialogue. That means acknowledging when we're wrong, celebrating when we're right, and always striving to base our arguments on truth, not emotion or ideology." His words struck a chord, drawing applause from parts of the audience and leaving the panelists visibly flustered. The clock ticked down, signaling the end of the broadcast. As the red light on the cameras blinked off, the tension in the studio reached its peak. The panelists exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of how to wrap up the discussion without further undermining their credibility. The host, clearly relieved that the segment was over, thanked Kash and the panel for their participation, though his smile looked forced. Kash, however, remained composed, gathering his folder and standing to leave. He knew he had accomplished what he set out to do: shine a light on the importance of facts and expose the dangers of unchecked assumptions. As he walked off the set, the buzz of conversation followed him, spilling into the corridors and beyond. Outside the studio, phones buzzed with notifications and debates raged on social media. For Kash, the victory wasn't personal. It was a reminder that preparation, patience, and truth could cut through even the thickest walls of bias and skepticism. And for the panelists, the lesson was equally clear. Underestimating your opponent could cost you everything. The moment the broadcast ended, the studio erupted into a flurry of activity. Crew members scrambled to dismantle equipment, while producers huddled near the control room, whispering urgently about how the segment had unfolded. For Kash Patel, the aftermath was calm but deliberate. He gathered his notes and tucked the document back into his folder, his movements slow and measured. Though the cameras were off, he knew the real impact of what had just happened was only beginning to ripple outward. The audience might have left their seats, but the conversation they'd witnessed wasn't over. It was just getting started. As Kash stepped out of the studio, he could already hear the hum of voices discussing what they'd seen. Some praised his poise under pressure, while others criticized him for being too calculated. But one thing was undeniable. The document he'd presented had shifted the narrative entirely. Social media platforms were ablaze with reactions, hashtags, trending as viewers dissected every word and gesture from the panelists and Kash alike. Clips of the segment were shared repeatedly, with commentators weighing in from all sides. Supporters hailed him as a master strategist, someone who had turned the tables on his opponents with precision timing. Critics accused him of staging a publicity stunt, though even they struggled to deny the credibility of the evidence he'd provided. Meanwhile, inside the studio, the panelists gathered awkwardly near the host's desk. Their earlier confidence had vanished, replaced by a mix of frustration and disbelief. One of them, the sharp-tongued woman who had led much of the attack against Kash, paced back and forth, muttering under her breath. "How did we let this happen?" She asked no one in particular, her voice tinged with anger. Another panelist shrugged, trying to mask his discomfort. "It's not like we didn't prepare," he said defensively. "We just, underestimated him." The host, still seated at his desk, sighed heavily and rubbed his temples. "This is going to blow up online," he muttered, glancing at his phone. Notifications poured in nonstop, each one bringing fresh commentary and criticism about how the segment had played out. He had expected a lively debate, perhaps even some heated exchanges, but nothing like this. Kash had managed to hijack the entire conversation, turning it into a showcase for his perspective rather than the lopsided critique the panel had planned. The host couldn't help but feel a pang of regret for not foreseeing the possibility that Kash might come armed with irrefutable evidence. Back in the green room, Kash sat quietly, scrolling through his phone as messages flooded in from colleagues, friends, and supporters. Many congratulated him on his performance, praising his ability to stay composed under fire. Others sent links to articles and social media posts analyzing the segment, offering their thoughts on its implications. Kash read each message carefully, absorbing the feedback without letting it sway his focus. He knew that while the immediate reaction was positive, the long-term effects would depend on how people chose to engage with the facts he had presented. That was always the challenge, getting people to look beyond the noise and focus on substance. Outside the studio, news outlets began picking up the story almost immediately. Analysts debated whether Kash's approach had been brilliant or overly theatrical. Some argued that presenting a single document during a live broadcast was a risky move, one that could easily backfire if the evidence hadn't held up. Others pointed out that the panelists' inability to counter Kash effectively spoke volumes about the strength of his preparation. Regardless of where people stood, everyone agreed on one thing: the segment had been unforgettable. By evening, talk shows and podcasts dedicated entire episodes to dissecting the events of the day. Hosts replayed key moments from the broadcast, pausing to highlight Kash's expressions or the panelists' reactions. Memes and GIFs circulated widely, capturing everything from Kash's calm demeanor to the increasingly flustered looks on the panelists' faces. Late-night comedians joked about the document heard round the world, while political analysts broke down its contents line by line. It seemed impossible to escape the conversation, as opinions spilled across television screens, radio, waves, and digital feeds. For the panelists, the fallout was particularly harsh. Social media users mocked their attempts to discredit Kash, pointing out how quickly their arguments had unraveled once the document came into play. One clip of the youngest panelist stammering mid-sentence went viral, accompanied by captions like, "When you realize you're losing." Another commentator's sarcastic remark about the document being irrelevant became a meme, shared thousands of times alongside screenshots of the actual evidence. The backlash was swift and merciless, leaving the panelists scrambling to defend themselves in interviews and op-eds. Despite the chaos surrounding them, Kash remained focused on the bigger picture. He gave a brief interview later that evening, reiterating the importance of basing discussions on facts rather than assumptions. "What happened today wasn't about me or the panelists," he said. "It was about showing that accountability requires transparency, and that means looking at the evidence no matter how uncomfortable it might be." His words resonated with many, reinforcing the idea that meaningful change begins with honesty and integrity. As the day drew to a close, the impact of the broadcast continued to spread. Viewers who had initially tuned in expecting entertainment found themselves reflecting on the broader themes of truth, bias, and responsibility. Educators incorporated clips from the segment into classroom discussions, encouraging students to think critically about media narratives. Journalists wrote think pieces exploring the role of evidence in public discourse, questioning whether debates like this one could serve as a model for future conversations. Even critics of Kash admitted that the episode had sparked important questions about how society engages with information. For Kash, the day ended much as it had begun, with quiet determination. He returned home, reviewed the feedback he'd received, and made notes for future appearances. He understood that moments like this were fleeting, opportunities to make an impact before the cycle moved on to the next big story. But he also knew that the document he'd presented, and the principles it represented, would continue to resonate long after the headlines faded. In a world often dominated by noise, sometimes all it took was one clear, undeniable fact to remind people of the power of truth. And for Kash Patel, that was enough. The days following the broadcast felt like a whirlwind, not just for Kash Patel but for everyone involved. The segment had become a cultural moment, sparking conversations that transcended politics and spilled into everyday life. At coffee shops, dinner tables, and office break rooms, people debated what they had seen. Some praised Kash's composure and reliance on evidence, while others dismissed him as calculated or overly strategic. Regardless of where individuals stood, one thing was clear. The document he had presented had ignited a firestorm of discussion that showed no signs of dying down. For Kash, the aftermath was a mix of reflection and forward momentum. He spent hours reviewing feedback, both positive and negative, trying to gauge how the public had responded to his message. Supporters flooded his social media accounts with messages of gratitude, calling him a voice of reason in an increasingly polarized world. Critics, however, accused him of exploiting the platform for personal gain, suggesting that his calm demeanor masked ulterior motives. Kash took it all in stride, understanding that such reactions were inevitable when challenging deeply held beliefs. What mattered most to him was the core idea he had tried to convey, that meaningful dialogue required grounding in facts, not assumptions. Meanwhile, the panelists from the broadcast faced mounting pressure. Their initial confidence during the segment now seemed like hubris in hindsight, and many viewers were quick to point this out. Social media users relentlessly mocked their inability to counter Kash's evidence, turning their missteps into viral memes. One particularly biting post featured a split-screen image of the panelists' smirks fading into looks of bewilderment as Kash calmly explained the document. The caption read, "When your plan backfires spectacularly." Another meme showed a graph titled, "Confidence Levels," with a sharp decline marked at the exact moment Kash introduced the document. These posts spread rapidly, amplifying the embarrassment the panelists already felt. In interviews and opinion pieces, the commentators tried to defend themselves, claiming they had been blindsided by Kash's tactics. "We weren't given any prior notice about the document," one of them argued in a morning talk show appearance. "It wasn't a fair fight." But their attempts to shift blame only fueled further criticism. Audiences pointed out that Kash hadn't violated any rules. He had simply come better prepared. If anything, one viewer commented online, "This proves why you should never underestimate your opponent." The host of the show also found himself under scrutiny. Known for his ability to navigate contentious discussions, he was criticized for losing control of the narrative. Analysts noted how quickly the dynamic had shifted once Kash introduced the document, leaving the host struggling to steer the conversation back on track. Clips of his awkward pauses and forced smiles circulated widely, accompanied by captions like, "When you realize you're out of your depth." For someone accustomed to being in charge, the experience was humbling, forcing him to reconsider how he approached future broadcasts. As the debate raged online, traditional media outlets joined the fray, dedicating segments and articles to dissecting every aspect of the broadcast. Some focused on the document itself, analyzing its contents, and verifying its claims. Independent fact-checkers confirmed that much of what Kash had presented aligned with publicly available records, lending further credibility to his arguments. Others examined the broader implications of the episode, questioning whether debates like this could serve as a blueprint for more productive discussions. A few pundits even suggested that the segment highlighted a growing demand for accountability, not just from politicians or public figures, but from media personalities as, well, educators and thought leaders seized the opportunity to use the broadcast as a teaching tool. In classrooms across the country, teachers played clips of the segment to illustrate the importance of critical thinking and evidence-based reasoning. Students discussed how bias can cloud judgment and why it's crucial to question assumptions before drawing conclusions. One professor remarked, "This is exactly the kind of real-world example we need to help young people understand the value of truth in a post-truth era." Despite the widespread attention, Kash remained grounded. He avoided engaging directly in the online frenzy, choosing instead to focus on the bigger picture. In interviews, he emphasized that the goal had never been to embarrass anyone but to highlight the importance of transparency and accountability. "The issues we face as a society are too complex to be reduced to sound bites or slogans," he said in one appearance. "We need to move beyond rhetoric and start addressing problems, with solutions rooted in reality." His words struck a chord with many, reinforcing the idea that progress required effort, patience, and honesty. Behind the scenes, Kash reflected on the lessons learned from the experience. He recognized that moments like this were rare, opportunities to cut through the noise and make a lasting impression. But he also understood that the work didn't end with one successful broadcast. If anything, the attention brought new challenges, including heightened expectations and increased scrutiny. Moving forward, he knew he would have to continue advocating for transparency while staying vigilant against attempts to undermine his message. For the panelists, the road ahead was less certain. They faced difficult questions about how to rebuild trust with their audiences, many of whom felt let down by their performance. Some doubled down on their original critiques of Kash, insisting that his approach was manipulative. Others acknowledged their mistakes, admitting that they had underestimated him and promising to do better in the future. Whether these efforts would restore their credibility remained to be seen. As the dust began to settle, the true impact of the broadcast became clearer. It wasn't just about who won or lost the debate. It was about the ripple effects it created. Viewers who had tuned in expecting entertainment walked away with something far more valuable, a reminder of the power of preparation, the importance of evidence, and the potential for meaningful dialogue in even the most contentious settings. For Kash Patel, the experience reinforced his belief that truth, when wielded with care and conviction, could transcend partisanship and spark change. And for those who witnessed it, the segment served as a powerful lesson in how quickly the tables can turn when facts take center stage. In the weeks that followed, the ripple effects of the broadcast continued to shape conversations far beyond the confines of the studio. What had started as a single segment on a political talk show had evolved into a cultural touchstone, sparking debates about truth, accountability, and the role of evidence in public discourse. For Kash Patel, the experience was both validating and humbling. He knew that moments like this were fleeting, a rare convergence of preparation, timing, and opportunity. But he also recognized the responsibility that came with it. The document he had presented wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a symbol of what could be achieved when facts took precedence over rhetoric. Kash's schedule became busier than ever as invitations poured in from news outlets, conferences, and universities eager to hear him speak. Each appearance gave him a chance to reinforce his message, that transparency and accountability weren't partisan issues but universal principles essential for progress. Audiences responded to his calm demeanor and unwavering focus, finding solace in his insistence on grounding discussions in evidence rather than emotion. At one event, a young student approached him after his speech, clutching a notebook filled with questions. "How do you stay so calm when people attack you?" she asked, her voice tinged with admiration. Kash smiled, pausing before answering. "Because I know the truth is stronger than any insult," he said simply. "If you're confident in your facts, there's no need to get defensive." The panelists, on the other hand, faced a different kind of reckoning. Their initial attempts to downplay the significance of the document had fallen flat, leaving them struggling to regain credibility. Some tried to pivot by focusing on unrelated topics, hoping to distract from their missteps during the broadcast. Others doubled down on their critiques of Kash, accusing him of exploiting the situation for personal gain. But none of these strategies seemed to resonate with audiences, who remained fixated on the moment when the panelists' confidence had crumbled under the weight of undeniable evidence. Social media users continued to mock their reactions, turning their stumbles into memes and jokes that refused to fade. One commentator, however, decided to take a different approach. In an op-ed published in a major newspaper, she admitted that she and her colleagues had underestimated Kash and failed to adequately prepare for the discussion. "We went into that studio expecting to dominate the conversation," she wrote. "Instead, we learned a hard lesson about the dangers of assuming you know better than your opponent." Her candor earned praise from some quarters, with readers applauding her willingness to acknowledge her mistakes. Others remained skeptical, questioning whether the admission was genuine or merely an attempt to salvage her reputation. Either way, the article marked a turning point, signaling a shift in how the panelists were beginning to process the experience. For the host of the show, the aftermath was equally challenging. Known for his ability to navigate contentious discussions, he found himself grappling with doubts about his own performance. Clips of his awkward pauses and forced smiles continued to circulate online, serving as a reminder of how quickly the dynamic had shifted once Kash introduced the document. Determined to learn from the experience, he invited experts on media ethics and communication to appear on his program, using their insights to explore ways to foster more constructive dialogue. In one episode, He openly reflected on the broadcast, acknowledging that he had underestimated Kash's preparation and overestimated his panel's ability to counter him effectively. It was a wake-up call, he admitted. Sometimes the best thing we can do is listen and let the facts speak for themselves. As the conversation around the broadcast expanded, so too did its impact on broader societal discussions. Educators incorporated clips of the segment into lessons on critical thinking, encouraging students to analyze how bias and assumptions can distort perceptions. Journalists wrote think pieces exploring the role of evidence in shaping narratives, questioning whether debates like this could serve as a model for future conversations. Even late-night comedians, while poking fun at the panelists' flustered reactions, highlighted the importance of holding public figures accountable through transparent, fact-based dialogue. The episode had become more than just a viral moment. It was a catalyst for reflection and change. Kash watched these developments unfold with quiet satisfaction. He understood that the real test lay in how people chose to act on the lessons they had learned. Would viewers walk away inspired to demand greater accountability from leaders and institutions? Or would the momentum fizzle out, reduced to nothing more than fleeting entertainment? He hoped for the former, believing that even small shifts in perspective could lead to meaningful progress over time. To that end, he continued to engage with audiences, sharing resources and tools to help them navigate complex issues with clarity and integrity. By the time the initial buzz began to subside, the legacy of the broadcast was firmly established. It wasn't just about who had won or lost the debate. It was about the enduring power of truth to transcend partisanship and spark change. Viewers who had tuned in expecting drama walked away with something far more valuable: a renewed appreciation for the importance of evidence-based reasoning and honest dialogue. For Kash Patel, the experience reinforced his belief that preparation and patience could cut through even the thickest walls of skepticism and bias. And for those who witnessed it, the segment served as a powerful reminder that accountability, when pursued with conviction, could illuminate paths forward, even in the darkest of times. As Kash returned to his daily routine, he carried with him the knowledge that moments like this were rare but impactful. They required not only courage, but also a steadfast commitment to principles that transcended personal agendas. He knew the road ahead wouldn't always be easy. There would be challenges, criticisms, and setbacks, but he also knew that the pursuit of truth was worth every effort. For Kash, the broadcast wasn't the end of a journey. It was the beginning of a larger mission to inspire others to seek clarity in a world often clouded by noise. And for everyone who had watched, debated, or shared the story, it was proof that sometimes all it takes is one clear, undeniable fact to remind us of the power of truth.